Today we are going to begin talking about Thomas Nagel's 1986 book, The View from Nowhere. I think that the approach that Nagel lays out to philosophical problems in this book is novel, fruitful, and potentially capable of being applied to a diverse array of issues. So my aim in this series of videos will be to first show what Nagel's approach is, then to show how Nagel applies this approach to particular philosophical problems in the first several chapters of the book. In particular, we'll look at his solution to the mind-body problem and the problem of personal identity. What I really appreciate in Nagel's approach is that it cuts against the grain of contemporary philosophy in its willingness to speculate freely, and its recognition that the tools we currently are working with are likely totally inadequate to deal with the problems that we face. It's this recognition of the limitation of our current methods which opens the possibility of developing new and novel approaches to old and intractable problems, which I think has implications not just for philosophy, but also to how we understand ourselves and the world we live in more generally. I'll eventually raise several objections to Nagel's approach and offer some criticism in regards to how Nagel sees his philosophical program through. In particular, what I think are implications of Nagel's approach that he himself does not draw and which would lead to more radical results than Nagel recognizes. Nagel offers a compelling diagnosis of a fundamental conflict or split in the life and thought of beings like us, and the possibility, at least in some instances, of reconciliation. Ultimately, however, I think that Nagel's philosophical vision succumbs to the very same temptation toward objective expanse that he elsewhere criticizes. As long as outer ascent to more objective realms remains disconnected from the sources of life that sustain it, the objective views we attain will only serve to further alienate us from ourselves. What is currently needed is not a journey outward, but rather a journey inward, a descent into worlds of mystery and magic. It is only in the descent into the depths of psychic life that the sources of life which sustain us can be reconnected to. We'll come to this thesis in a later video. But for now, let's begin by looking at the introduction to Nagel's book, The View from Nowhere. Nagel thinks that he recognizes a fundamental tension at the core of philosophical issues about morality, knowledge, freedom, the relation of the mind to the physical world, etc. In fact, the tension that Nagel identifies seems to be one that crops up in any account we attempt to give of the world that also includes ourselves. This tension is one that arises from a clash between two viewpoints. On the one hand, we experience the world from a subjective, first-person point of view. There's something that it's like to be us, a certain way in which the world appears to creatures like us through our impressions, sensations, and thoughts. On the other hand, we can understand the world from an objective, third-person point of view by detaching from this subjective perspective and viewing ourselves and the world from the outside. Here's the problem. This objective view of the world requires us to detach from our particular first-person perspective, to view ourselves from the outside and leave those specific subjective capacities and conditions behind. However, the subjective conditions also exists within that very same objective world. In other words, subjective points of view exist. And if the objective view of the world requires us to leave those subjective views behind, it's unclear how to include these subjective points of view in an objective understanding. If those subjective views exist, our objective view ought to be able to include them in an account of what is. So the question for Nagel is, can we combine these two points of view? Is the objective conception capable of being reconciled with its subjective origins? Nagel thinks that the recognition of the tension between these views will enable us to explore attempts at reconciliation. But it will also result in the recognition that sometimes reconciliation of the views is impossible. When views can't be reconciled, Nagel thinks we need to admit as much. He writes, "Apart from the chance that this kind of tension will generate something new, it is best to be aware of the way in which life and thought are split if that is how things are." What Nagel is offering us then is not a complete worldview, but rather, quote, "a way of looking at the world and living in it that is suitable for complex beings without a naturally unified standpoint." Instead of a unified worldview, we get the interplay of these two uneasily related types of conception and the essentially incompletable effort to reconcile them. Let's dig into this a bit further. Here's a basic scheme for how Nagel conceptualizes the movement toward objective understanding. We start with our particular subjective view of the world, the way the world appears to us. That's point of view 1. The relation R that POV 1 stands into the world. And of course, the world that is disclosed through that point of view, W1. To understand an event or state of affairs objectively, we detach from our initial view of the world and form a new conception of the world, point of view 2, which has that original view and its relation to the world as its object. We've managed to place ourselves in the world that is to be understood. We now view ourselves from the outside. Let's consider a simple example. When you stub your toe, it sucks. It hurts. You feel immediately the sensation of pain from your first-person perspective, from point of view 1. But we can also understand this experience from an objective third-person perspective, point of view 2, by stepping back from our immediate first-person immersion in the experience and looking at the situation from the outside. When you stub your toe, you're slamming it with a force to 2 to 3 times your body weight. And since your toe has a tiny surface area, that force can't spread out. So the pain stays concentrated at that point of impact. There's that aching throb that comes after. From the objective view, we've left the first-person point of view behind, the way the pain appears to you from your first-person perspective, that is, the sensation of pain. We've stepped outside of ourselves and taken that first-person point of view and the relation it stands into the world and made it the object of our new objective point of view. What occurs objectively in your sensation of pain can be understood by any rational being. Of course, understanding from this detached view doesn't entail that one will also understand what the pain of stubbing one's toe is like, the subjective first personal experience of pain themselves. The objective view says little to nothing about what the experience of pain is like, its intrinsic subjective character. So a view is more objective the less it relies on any creature's makeup or particular position in the world, and the old, more subjective view comes to be regarded as an appearance, the way the pain appears to me, for instance. And for Nagel, this more objective view can itself become subject to a process of further objectification. Nagel writes, "Objectivity allows us to transcend our particular viewpoint and develop an expanded consciousness that takes in the world more fully. All this applies to values and attitudes as well as to beliefs and theories." So there's a question here about what to do with the older, more subjective view and how to combine it with the new objective view, because those earlier perspectives are still a part of the world. A challenge for the newly formed objective view is how to include the subjective point of view from which it arose in its conception of reality. If the new objective view were taken to be exhaustive of what there is, then we might be tempted to reduce the experience of the sensation of pain to a mere appearance that need not be referenced in our description of reality at all. Yet it is precisely that appearance, that subjective first-person experience of the pain, that gives the objective view its traction to begin with. So, for Nagel, it must also be included in our conception of reality. But how should we go about doing this? In the case of the sensation of pain, the views are easily reconcilable. Having the experience of pain and also being offered the objective description of what is occurring in that experience allows you to coordinate those views and achieve a kind of synthesis between them to see how they are interrelated or at least compatible with each other. So, in some cases, the two views will achieve integration, but not always. If the views are not reconcilable, we need to be ready to admit as much, if that is how things really are, if life and thought really are split in such a way. Now's a good time to note, however, that for Nagel, the impulse toward objectivity has its limits, and it runs up against significant risks and dangers. We can't get outside of ourselves completely. Whatever we do, no matter how objective our view, we are a part of the world, and there's no telling how much of that world might remain permanently outside of our reach. An even more serious limitation to a maximally objective view is that there are things about us and our world that can't be understood from such a view, because a lot of what there is in the world can only be understood from a subjective point of view. Thus, the desire to give a complete account of the world in maximally objective terms results in false reductions. The main type of reductionism we'll focus on here is psychophysical reductionism, the attempt to reduce psychological phenomena to physics and chemistry. An area in which such false reductions occur most blatantly, according to Nagel, is in the philosophy of mind, where widely held views such as physicalism and functionalism are motivated by the assumption that whatever there is to understand must be understood in a narrowly objective way. For many philosophers, the world described by physics exemplifies what we can properly understand as reality. This is where we have achieved the greatest detachment from the specifically human perspective on the world. The detachment from the subjective view that physics offers us, however, leaves out, quote, the irreducibly subjective character of conscious mental processes. The temptation here is to conclude that the subjectivity of consciousness can't ultimately figure into an account of what is, can't be a constitutive feature of reality, since it eludes all attempt to capture it from the objective point of view. But this, according to Nagel, results in a false reduction. Nagel writes, "The subjectivity of consciousness is an irreducible feature of reality, without which we couldn't do physics or anything else, and it must occupy as fundamental a place in any credible worldview as matter, energy, space, time, and numbers." So, how do we include the subjectivity of consciousness within an objective view of the world? How do we achieve integration between these views? Nagel writes, "I believe it is already clear that any correct theory of the relation between mind and body would radically transform our overall conception of the world, and would require a new understanding of the phenomena now thought of as physical." I find this sentiment appealing. The project of understanding perspectives, states of consciousness, as features of the objective world requires us to think deeply about our current theories of mind and matter. These are issues we will return to in later videos. How mental phenomena are related to the brain, how personal identity is related to the biological persistence of the organism, etc. We also see the drive to maximally objective views in ethics, according to Nagel. Our ability to detach from our purely personal desires and interests and view them from the outside enables us to develop new, more universal and objective motives. But the tension between the objectivity gained in regards to more universal motives and the subjective personal views from which that view arises is fraught. How do we combine objective and subjective values in a single life? Bringing them together is tricky. If we focus too much on the objective, then that view dominates and leaves out the necessary individual perspective from which a life is lived. So Nagel's question is, how do we design ethics for an individual human life? He writes, one has to be the creature whom one has subjected to detached examination, and one has in one's entirety to live in the world that has been revealed to an extremely distilled fraction of oneself. The world that is revealed to us objectively is not the world as such. In fact, it's a small portion of what is. The mistake in most contemporary philosophy is to assume that reality cannot go beyond what we could in principle objectively think about. This is, according to Nagel, a special form of idealism because it sets up a certain type of human understanding as the last word about what can be said about reality. But why should we think that reality will reveal itself to our objective understanding alone? Going in the opposite direction, however, is just as foolish. Anti-scientism, for instance, can result in a rejection of science altogether. Nagel thinks that we should strive for greater levels of objective understanding, but do so in the awareness that what is revealed to us through that understanding will only ever be a fraction of what is. And to assume that we already possess all the tools we need to understand reality in its completeness is a mistake. Nagel writes, too much time is wasted because of the assumption that methods already in existence will solve problems for which they were not designed. Too many hypotheses and systems of thought in philosophy and elsewhere are based on the bizarre view that we, at this point in history, are in possession of the basic forms of understanding needed to comprehend absolutely anything. Nagel contends that the methods needed to understand ourselves do not yet exist, and his book contains speculative accounts about the world and how we might fit into it. In the next video, we'll look at how the tension between the objective and subjective views discussed here open up for Nagel a distinction between physical objectivity and mental objectivity. Nagel then uses this notion of mental objectivity to address the problem of other minds and concludes with some reflections on consciousness in general. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.